the trans community has a serious language issue that we can't figure out, and it's impacting the ability for us to be culturally understood and even the capacity for trans individuals to discuss and even access the care that they need. The intention of this video is to start a conversation about the language within the trans community, especially regarding definitions, history, and the use of words like transsexual and transgender. I'd like to foster a more functional definition of these terms that is useful for providing needed resources, support, and advocacy for these groups. Let's talk definitions. Let's start from the top to get a basic understanding of the LGBTQ community. So the acronym stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and Q is for queer or questioning. I've heard both. So we're discussing the T specifically in this video, although there might be some overlap. We might mention other communities as well. To be transgender is to experience a phenomenon where either your gendered behavior or the verbal declaration of a person's gender identity is incongruent with their assigned sex or their natal gender category, and is congruent with some other gender behavior category. So this definition comes from Dr. Thomas Bevan's 2015 book called The Psychobiology of Transsexualism and Transgenderism, which I found mainly useful in researching this particular video. In simpler terms, a transgender person will have an experience where their felt experience of gender, like the cultural and behavioral implications of their sex and things like that, will be different from the sex that was assigned to them at birth. Furthermore, a transsexual person is a transgender individual who either desires to or actively engages in transsexual transition, which includes hormone replacement therapy and or many forms of surgery. In another book, What's the Tea by Juno Dawson, which is a much friendlier read, I would say, in chapter 2, it states that a transsexual person is simply a person that has taken physical steps to change their sex characteristics, which I think is a pretty decent definition. So let's make sure that we understand how this works with a few examples. So this is Jax. Jax was born male, and ever since they were little, they seemed pretty effeminate and flamboyant. They played with girls' toys, but they never really claimed to be a girl or verbally communicated any distress about their birth sex. They were uncomfortable with their birth name and the pronouns that were being used for them, and began to kind of verbalize this a little bit in middle school. So they began going by the name Jax and using they them pronouns, and they dress kind of androgynously, but maybe on the more masculine side. Jax is fine with their genitals and their sex characteristics, but they want to make sure that they can still access legal name change, and also wanted to legally change their legal documents and things like that to make sure that it matches their gender identity. Next, we have Rodney. So Rodney was born female, and he was a bit of a tomboy growing up, and he was in a pretty sheltered home. He often played with other boys growing up, and he didn't really pay too much attention to his body. But when he hit puberty, he kind of ignored the discomfort as much as possible. But when he hit his mid-20s, and he was living as a lesbian, he was able to recognize this disconnection to his body as gender dysphoria, and met with medical professionals to get him on the path to taking hormones. Rodney is planning to have top surgery next year, and he needs to have insurance coverage that is inclusive to trans people and helps him live an authentically healthy life. So, within these two examples, can you tell who is transgender and who is transsexual? I mean, specifically according to the definition I've used in this video. What do you think? Well, Jax has a disconnection to the gender that they were assigned at birth. That makes them transgender. Rodney also has this feeling of disconnection to his gender, but he's also extremely disconnected from his birth sex. And the sex characteristics are the things that are moving him towards the necessary medical treatments to change those things. I need to make very clear that this conversation is not about who is more valid. It's about who needs what resources and building compassion as a society to provide resources to these individuals. Now, there are a ton of ways to be transsexual and even more ways to be transgender. These are just a few examples of how it can show up. And I also want to make sure to clarify that the point of knowing these definitions isn't to go out and start to put all trans people into categories. So if there's a trans people who meets the criteria to be a transsexual, but they just hate that word, that's okay. We don't need to force this language onto other people. But I do think knowing it can provide utility in some situations, and even in my experience, it does help individuals to better and more quickly understand what trans people experience and kind of the differences between the two experiences. So why are people even trans? Dr. Bevan conducted a literature review in this book, and the data makes it clear that there are neurological and neurophysiological differences in the brains of transsexual and transgender individuals that suggest the phenomenon of being, transsexual or transgender does have some type of a biological basis. Though this also communicated that the structures that may mitigate gender disposition are probably not found in one single location, but they may be, distributed all throughout the brain. It was only in 1973, just over 50 years ago, when homosexuality was no longer classified as a mental illness by the DSM. I, of course, understand that there are many people who still believe that being gay or trans is some type of chemical imbalance or illness or something that's either brought on by trauma or bad parenting. But there has been a greater, cultural acceptance of gay folks generally, and education has been a big part of that. I do hope in the same way that to see some of that cultural acceptance for transgender individuals, just as humans with some neurological differences, that may need some cultural, societal, or even medical intervention to help support their inclusion into society. So why do we feel so strange about using this word transsexual? So there are a lot of reasons why the word transsexual seems to ruffle people's feathers, especially in the trans community. But to better understand this, let's do an autopsy of the word transvestite, which will help us get a little bit of a better understanding of the culture. In 1910, Magnus Hirschfeld released a book which in English is translated to just transvestite. And this word comes from the Latin trans, which is across and beyond, and vestir, which means to dress. This was about sexual interest in cross-dressing. However, his work seems to include a wide range of individuals who cross-dress, as he seemed to use the term to describe those who habitually wore clothes usually designated to the opposite sex, but he would work with males and females of all sexual orientations. Hirschfeld was actually the surgeon who performed the first recorded sexual reassignment surgery, and he actually helped a lot of his patients access legal name change in Germany, which really showed that he had support for the people who we would consider transsexual and transgender today from the definitions we've talked about. The word transvestite continued to be used to refer to this wide group of individuals, noting that some transsexual and transgender people used the word to describe themselves back in the day as well. If you watched my Paris is Burning video, you will see some examples in that documentary, that was released back in the early 1990s and stuff like that, and they use that word a lot. The word transvestism was also used in the DSM to pathologize cross-dressing, and this bolstered society's already bigoted perspectives of gender nonconforming individuals, whether they were trans or not. American culture is and was deeply influenced by Judeo-Christian perspectives, and supporting rigid gender roles provided a lot of useful functions, such as bolstering the cultural roles needed for capitalism to function as intended. However, LGBT queens, kings, and royalty came together to fight against stigma and encourage the public to use words like cross-dresser in place of transvestite, and it's mostly stuck. I personally don't see transvestite being used as often these days, although it still is being used and some people still use that word to describe themselves. In a similar way, transsexualism was also used in a pathologizing manner in the past, and was used like through 1994 to diagnose trans people, almost demonizing the term and creating a lot of negative associations with the term. Also, with the word like sex being in there, some individuals made the connection to the fetishization of trans individuals and really thinking that, transsexual people were inherently deviant. And there's actually a surprising amount of people that I've come across that think that transsexual is a type of sexual orientation, which was pretty surprising to me. So I know that there is more needed education of the public. We still need to talk about this stuff. This word was typically seen as old and outdated by many people, including myself. However, I've noticed that a lot of older transsexuals in the community very much embrace this word, and some in a way that they literally think that they are the elite because they have had all the surgeries, and others just because it's an accurate way to describe their experience. Some people really hate the word, and I can't blame them. However, I am here to plant my flag as a non-binary transsexual. Thank you. Thank you guys.
I completely reject non-binary people specifically.
Okay, well, I forgot about the sect of transsexuals who are so exclusive that it actually hurts them. They believe that in order to be transsexual, you had to have actually had all the surgeries. So if there's a person who desires HRT and SRS, but they have a disabling condition that prevents them from doing that, well, they're not a true transsexual. And in my opinion, that is an incredibly ableist and classist projection. Disabled transsexuals, as well as transsexuals in poverty, may not be able to access medical transition, and that doesn't change the fact they are transsexual. In addition, there are those who hold that you must want to have the standard binary transition in order to be a transsexual. They may hold that a diagnosis is a requirement in order to really be transsexual.
We're not here to groom anybody. We're just here to tell our stories. What it is to be a transsexual. Someone who was diagnosed as transsexual by 3 psychiatrists. I am a member of the elite, the transsexual community. If you're interested in listening to me rant, stick around. If you're a troll or a turf, an extreme transgender person, and especially if you're non-binary, you need to just check yourself out. I don't play with you people, because I live in the real world.
But once again, this neglects the large number of transsexuals around the globe who can't access diagnosis or medical treatment. This rigid definition honestly is unnecessarily exclusive and can hold back the community from sharing useful information with each other. For me as a non-binary transsexual, sharing advice on how I dealt with scar care or what it's like to navigate the world as someone who is, starting to be read more and more often as a Black man. Transsexual men are my brothers, and sharing information and resources is how our community has always thrived. Speaking of community, what do real life trans people think? I spent some time asking questions in Facebook groups as well as scouring the internet for a couple of different perspectives, and I found widely differing opinions that I would really like to mention. The single most common negative opinion was that the term is outdated. Some have the mindset that, this term is okay for older trans people to use. Some people find the term like gross, and that is, it is inherently fetishizing. Some people in this camp are able to get why other people use it, but some think it really should never be used. A lot of people think that the term sexualizes trans people because, like, the word sex is in transsexual, and it suggests that, it might suggest to people's brains to think about sex. Some people feel that this word is a slur, and were some people who told their stories about their experiences with this word being used against them actively. So it's something that hurts them at this point. Another very common thought was that transsexual is mostly used by exclusionary trans medicalists, and that using this word might make people give you the side eye and even doubt your support of the community. I'm actually not going to lie, that was something that definitely stopped me from utilizing that word at the beginning at first, but now that I've done more research and I actually understand more about the history of the term and the utility of the word itself, my opinions have changed. So using that word might make people give you the side eye and even like doubt your support of the community. But the majority of the people who don't like that word are open to other people using it, although some think that it should be eradicated entirely. On the other hand, other trans people who had more positive opinions of the word thought of it as just an accurate descriptor for individuals who choose to medically transition or change their physical sex characteristics. That's, I think, one of the reasons why I find it so useful. It communicates a lot for me. Other people were saying that it definitely makes sense for those who have medically transitioned and can be helpful to communicate your intentions to other people very quickly. There are also some people who find the word nostalgic, as it was the only word used to refer to transgender people back in the day when some of the individuals, I was reading from were first coming out. And this is something that I related with, and I saw a couple of people who shared the opinion with me. But the word transsexual reminds me of the people who went before me and did the work of advocacy and literally just existing. And utilizing that word really helps me to feel more connected to the larger trans community. And, there was a bit of a shared sentiment across many people that this word is not one that should be adopted by the general public, but should be more used for transgender people to communicate what direction they may be going in terms of transition. I appreciate the comments that mention that we shouldn't be policing trans people's identities, and we should allow people to use the terms that work for them and to not gatekeep or impose our preferences on other people. Just let people be happy and make the decision that make them happy. Why does this matter? Why do I even care? Well, with all the noise in the political sphere, with Trump getting into office and signing, horrendous executive orders, this is not the time for nitpicking or gatekeeping and hostility within our community. it's clear that our rights are at risk. Whether you have, like pink hair and pronouns, and you just want to have the ID that accurately reflects your gender, or you may be the standard transsexual who just wants to get their transition over with, and they just want to move to a new area and kind of start fresh and like live so that nobody knows their past life or whatever. There was really no point for us transsexuals and transgender people to continue to attempt to separate ourselves from gender diverse individuals of any kind, whether cis or trans. Joining together as a stronger LGBTQ plus community is something that I hope to see, especially with the extra political pressure we are under right now. And with all of that said, I feel inclined to mention that trans people are not and will never be a monolith. We will never really have the same opinions and even definitions. However, I do hope that the goal of facilitating more effective communications in the community is within reach. But let's start in the comments section. Let me know what your thoughts are about reclaiming the word transsexual and how you feel about the community infighting regarding this topic. Do you think that there were any other concepts that I missed? Any other challenges to this word? Any other kind of topics that I'm missing? Please let me know. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you for watching. We'll see each other sometime soon. Why don't we put in the work to change that?